I am beyond emotions. They've been frozen dead in me. Here's your look at the Mondo. This is the Batman the Animated Series, Mr. Freeze 1/6 scale collectible figure. Mondo is proud to present their Batman the Animated Series, Mr. Freeze 1/6 scale collectible figure. Based on the seminal Batman the Animated Series, the Mr. Freeze 1/6 figure stays true to the animated classic, sculpted to match the iconic style of the show, and with a paint scheme evoking a bold, graphic look of an animated cell. Mr. Freeze was a highly anticipated figure on this collector's part. Super excited with what they did with the Batman the Animated Series 6-scale Batman, and definitely want to see them continue down the road of giving us additional 6-scale renditions of these fantastic looking animated counterparts. According to my trusty tape measure, would you believe Mr. Freeze stands 12.2 inches in height? It's right there. The proof is in the pudding. And in centimeters, that works out to be just a little over 31 centimeters, 31.1 to be exact. A big thank you, by the way, to the folks over at Mondo who were nice enough to send this sample my way. Mr. Freeze, along with the Batman, had come out in two different versions, a standard release and the Mondo exclusive, which I had a few extra goodies as well. If you are looking, by the way, to source this one out and pick it up and add it to your collection, currently over on Mondo's website, I believe Mr. Freeze is sadly sold out. But it's not to say that you couldn't go through your various different online searches to find a store that might have this guy available. And hopefully a review like this will help assist whether you want to add this one to your collection or not. It's a really neat looking piece. But as I said, there was also a deluxe exclusive of Mr. Freeze that came with a few extra goodies, like a morning head, for example, a shattered dome, and the tombstone of Nora, which I certainly would have liked to have added as sort of an accompanying piece for this Mr. Freeze. But the standard release will not have that. Let's have a look at the pieces, though, that do come with Mr. Freeze. We'll start the review with, of course, the one thing we always seem to look at when it comes to these 6-scale renditions, and that is the display stand. Treated very nicely here, we get an oval shape of the Bat logo, with sort of a carved-in groove of the actual Bat logo. I like that it's not just been printed on the surface. There's a little bit of elevation happening right there. On the underside of the base, there's not too much going on here, just basically Batman and all related characters and elements, trademark of DC Comics. The neck that will, of course, support the cradle, which, of course, will then support the figure. I believe is the same style of stand that we got ourselves with Skeletor, another Mondo release that we had looked at in an earlier review. As it stands, though, a really neat-looking display stand. Even if it doesn't have, like, for example, the exclusive Nora tombstone, which I would have really liked to have gotten. I'm really happy, though, with the types of accessories and the types of things that come included with the standard release. We'll have a look at those right now. Sadly for Mr. Freeze, when you think about it, he was only in 2 episodes of the original classic Batman the Animated Series. It's one of those slips of memory where you think he was actually in a lot more than what he was. He was really only in Heart of Ice of his first appearance and Deep Freeze before eventually finally getting his moment to shine in the standalone animated feature Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero, which I didn't like as much as the original 2 and only episodes that he appeared in, so you could imagine it would be a little bit more hard-pressed for Mondo to pull episode-specific accessories for their inclusion of the 6-scale version of Mr. Freeze. Instead, I think they did one better. They gave us basically all the accessories one would have hoped Mr. Freeze could have come included with, short of course, maybe the containment chamber housing Nora Freeze inside. Obviously, for the size and the real sheer amount of plastic that would have been involved for that. That would essentially be an exact same size to this figure, just as another standalone figure. So I can't imagine that they would have included Nora with that. But they have done, like I said, all the other things that you would expect Mr. Freeze to come included with. Let's have a look at those accessories right now. He comes included, smallest to largest. He comes included with his little ballerina. Now, of course, tipping my hat to the writing team that was responsible for the fantastic Batman animated series, one of my all-time favorite cartoons to watch. Mr. Freeze is really one of those characters that did best in the animated treatment because You took essentially like a two-dimensional character and you gave him a depth and a backstory that you felt so saddened for this character, and you can almost even entertain why he does what he does as Mr. Freeze. And that, again, can be contributed to the writing staff behind the animated Batman the Animated Series, which, again, is one of my all-time favorite series. So, to come included with that, Victor Freeze comes included with his little ballerina. Now, the ballerina does have a little bit of detailing done to the face. There's not much there, but for the most part, it's still a recreation of the one that he does have in the animated episode. Short of a little bit of frost that maybe could have also been added to this piece. It's just a nice little accompanying accessory that you can display in his hand. Now, he does come with a couple of various hands to hold it with, but it actually doesn't lodge itself in his hand. You sort of have to kind of wedge it in between the finger and the thumb. The plastic that they use for the hands is very dense plastic. So try prying that away, those fingers away from the palm is a little bit more of a difficult feat. But he does have somewhat of a hand to kind of hold the ballerina dome in place. Of course, we'll talk about the other hands in a second, but there's a lot of other cool trinkets I want to showcase first. He does come also with a encased Batarang, encased in ice, or the closest thing to ice, translucent blue plastic. You can see my hand running behind it. You would imagine Batman would have thrown the Batarang. Mr. Freeze quickly and promptly would have froze that with his freeze gun, and the Batarang would have fallen to the ground. Other than maybe just displaying it by the foot area of Mr. Freeze, I suppose you could also put it in his hand as well, like he has a couple of different hands that would be suited for holding the Batarang. And again, it's just a case where the plastic on these fingers is really, really dense, so you have to really kind of wedge the accessory in there. But he does have the necessary means to hold it if you wanted to. Some of the other accessories we can have a look at. He does come with an interchangeable head. We'll probably look at that in a second. Why don't we have a look at his freeze gun? Still to this day, one of my favorite things about Mr. Freeze was his old classic freeze gun. I think DC Collectibles is planning to produce, or is it maybe NECA Toys is planning to produce, a 1-to-1 scale, if memory serves me correctly, of the freeze gun. I would love to add that to my collection, part of my arsenal, if you will. This has been very faithfully recreated on a smaller scale, done in gray plastic with the lighter colors of gray making their appearances. Really, that will be a calling card for the majority of this figure. He has a lot of this neat sort of animated cell shading that is across the barrel of the gun, the top of the gun right here, and of course, like I said, through the majority of his suit. The freeze gun also has one additional thing that can be added to it, and obviously it's going to be a freeze blast. It serves to be a great display piece to be able to include this, as of course you can have it firing from Mr. Freeze's gun. Now on the side, I'm sure this is intentional, there's a little bit of plastic that's kind of created this little creased line on either side. You can see maybe from the front, it's created these little ledges on either side. The barrel of the gun is actually just a standard circle, so when you are putting it in place, you feel like it's really hitting some resistance. And I gotta believe they've done that maybe just so it stays in place. Obviously, like shapes of the same size will likely either just not allow you to put it back in, or just if it was a slightly smaller and it didn't have those little ledges, I feel like the blast would just fall out of the barrel. It doesn't seem like it's actually going anywhere. It's really neat in the way they've recreated that to look like it does in the series. The main blast of the beam and, of course, the spiraling snake of ice that wraps around it. It's a really cool way, I see what I've done there, to display Mr. Freeze. And likelihood I'll probably be displaying Mr. Freeze, I think, with the blast of the freeze gun, and the freeze gun, of course, in his hand. It's just, again, a really neat spectacle to see this on display. Now, again, fitting this into his hand, let me just pull this out for 1 second. There's a couple of different hands that are suited best for this. I believe it is, let's just grab, it's this one right here. You'll see that there's a little bit of a separation between the three fingers and then the pointer finger on the top, and then there's the thumb. You can fit it in his hand, but it's very, very difficult for all the same reasonings that I just mentioned. You sort of have to kind of put it in on an angle, like so. And then from there, just sort of navigate it down the fingers and the thumb. You got to kind of get it underneath the thumb, like that, just like that. And then once you feed it far enough down, just sort of twist it, like so. And like I said, it does fit into his hand, but it's very tight to do that. But at least, at the very least, it's going to stay in place, especially when you're going to be adding some additional weight by adding the blast beam in front of it. The next accessory we'll have a look at is the Cryo Tank that's going to fit on the back of the figure. This is obviously to keep the suit cool and to keep him alive. When you flip around the back of the figure, you're sort of treated to like an L shape. So there's only one way that you can attach that in place. When you are fitting it in, again, you're going to kind of have a little bit of resistance, but you just want to keep continuing to push it in until it's completely all the way. Now, the Cryo Tank has a little bit of this reflective light. It doesn't actually have in the series where there's this noticeable white stripe, but it's to simulate the lighting. You'll see a lot, again, of that carried over through the rest of his costume. And then from there, the other thing, of course, to finish the look of Mr. Freeze, so he doesn't die, of course, is he does come with his domed helmet. Now, the domed helmet just sits over top like this. When you do get this figure out of the packaging, he does have this like little ledge of clear plastic. You want to remove that first. It's just like a little lip of plastic, which I actually thought was a permanent piece until I saw a little label on the side that says, please remove, before, of course, displaying the figure. So once that's out of the way, you just go ahead and take the dome, fit it over top of his head. Don't worry, we'll have a closer look at the figure's head sculpt in a second, but that gives you the completed look for Mr. Freeze. A nice touch is by the fact that they added that little bit of frosting on the front of his dome. If you don't like that so much, what you can also do too is twist the dome to the sides, where it's only really then on the sides and you can get a better close-up look at his face, which obviously for the sculpt and care that they put into the piece, you really wouldn't want to hide the face too much. So I would probably recommend having it so the frost is on both sides, leaving the front section completely clear. Get a good look at the fantastic head sculpt that they did for Mr. Freeze here. He has his goggles over top of his eyes. If you did get yourself the Mondo exclusive, you would also get a morning Mr. Freeze that didn't have the goggles on front of his head. I mean, when it comes for me displaying the figure, I'll likely want to maybe go this route anyways. So I'm not too disappointed that the exclusive wasn't available. The head sculpt does have that little bit of shading, basically occupying the whole side of his head, exactly the way it looks in the animated show. I really like the fact that they added the shading. Leaving it completely blank, the head sculpt would still be good, but looking at it the way that it does, looking at the way that we are looking at right now, having that little bit of shading represented on the side, and then additionally to that, all this reflective little beams of light coming down the suit, really does make this feel and look like it was pulled from the cartoon. Now, there's a couple of different variations, 2 to be exact, of the way you can display the figure. If you get the standard release Mr. Freeze, he'll come with the regular portrait, the one that's currently on the neck, and he'll also come with the more angrier expression. The head sculpts are primarily the exact same, other than the mouth, which has been changed. The eyebrows are also pretty much in the same placement, maybe a little bit higher on this one right here. And to change out the head, all you're going to want to do is take the side. I would probably pull from the side and try to resist the urge of pulling it from the front. You wouldn't want to clip those eyebrows in the process. You just kind of wiggle that off. Very easy to remove from the ball joints and replace it with the head that you want to go with. You just sort of wiggle it back down in place. And you've got the more angrier expression Mr. Freeze, which still works with the dome. You can fit that over top like so. And again, that's a different way to display the figure. If you did get yourself the exclusive Mondo version of Mr. Freeze, he did also have the morning version, which is basically, again, just the goggles removed off the eyes and a more sombered look on his face. Now, not only do you get the dome, which is already pretty cool, and you do get yourself the 2 different head portraits. I'm going to refrain from using the term cool for the rest of this review, but Mr. Freeze also comes included with this. It's a bit of steam if he wants to let off some steam. Now I'm starting to sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze, but essentially this just fits over top of his head like so, and it's supposed to simulate when the dome is removed and he's basically just leaking and exhausting the steam out into the air. Obviously, you're going to see very little of Mr. Freeze's head. It's slightly more distorted because this is more warped, clear plastic. But it's a really cool way, there I go again saying that, of displaying the figure. The very likelihood I'll be displaying the figure with the exhausting steam coming out from his suit, of course the cold hitting the hot air, I probably will not display it just because I feel like the face gets lost in the mix. Again, it's the idea that Mondo would even include an accessory like this that makes this a really neat looking figure. At the end of the day, though, I'll just take that off And I think probably for displaying the figure, I'll either display him with the angry expression face with the dome, or I'll go with the more neutral face sculpt, again, along with the dome. So we spent some time looking at Mr. Freeze's fantastic head sculpt. For the time being, I went with the more angrier expression. And we've looked at, of course, at the cryo tank that was located on the back of his torso. But let's have a look at the rest of the figure, which is very simple the way it's been designed in the animated show. I kind of liked it that it felt more like one of those 30s sci-fi series serials where like Mr. Freeze looked in more of an awkward looking suit. Can't imagine he'd be moving around very freely in it. But again, that was the appeal of the character's design. The neat thing about it, though, we've already discussed the fact that it has this little reflective light running down the side, but that gray also starts making appearances in its legs, which normally would already be just standard black legs. As we get down to his boots, we are also treated to some slightly lighter purple, which has the darker shading represented on the sides, or the inside of the boots, which he also carries over into his gloves as well. Even like the hands have their own highlights and lowlights. Each of the individual fingers, this is really impressive, each of the individual fingers are painted with the lighter colors and patches of purple, with the darker colors, again, on the more interior areas of the gloves. Now, with his suit, you got the lighter color of his torso, of course, the darker colors of his legs and his arms. But then for the torso, like the shoulder sections, the elbows, and then the wrists, he's got these bands that he would have had in the cartoon. These were all done in blue, and like in the series, you've got these little areas of reflective light. Now, I like this area. I like the reflection on the front of his torso, and I don't mind it here even on his lower kind of torso, his waist section. I do think, though, I probably would have gone a little thinner on the light that's right here. Even though it is in this series, it's a little too broad, I feel, on this figure. If it was just a little bit thinner. Again, I love the direction that they went with it, but if they just made it slightly a little bit thinner than what they have done here. One other thing, too, that's kind of clever that the way they've done this. Looking at this, you would think that this is plastic, and I guess in some ways you would be correct. It's kind of a very soft rubber plastic. It does one of two things. It allows to hide the joints. You're still seeing it, yes, on the shoulders. You're not seeing it as much in the elbows, but it kind of, again, makes it more movable. You got to believe if this was solid plastic, moving the arms would be very difficult at best. But what they've done instead is they've encased it in like a rubber tubing. Now, I am a little worrisome about long-term down the road. I'm hoping this is a case. Now, I have not had any issues in the past with rubber suits or rubber overlays on figures. A lot of things can contribute to it. Of course, the moisture that you have in your room, the temperature, and of course, if you also have a light source. If you have hotter rooms or areas of drier air, things like this can become a little bit more brittle and start splitting. I don't have that issue, and the reasoning why I say I don't have that issue is because not across the entire board can all of these figures have problematic issues. These were done in softer rubber, and if you had, say for example, a Detolf that had lighting on it all the time and you were in a drier environment, I would be a little bit more worrisome that this may split over time. As it stands, for the time that I've been sort of playing around with the figure, I haven't had any real issues with it at all. But basically what it is, it's just wrapping over top of the joint. And like I said, this is all done in a softer rubber. It still allows the figure's arms to move perfectly fine. You can, again, move them forward and back, and no issues really whatsoever there. Even bending the elbow, they've very conveniently hidden the joint right underneath those tubings. Again, let me just show you how that works. See? Completely hidden it. Really clever the way that they've done that. That is in the shoulders, that soft rubber. That's in the elbows. Again, that soft rubber tubing. It's in the wrists, and down below, it's also in the boots. The boots I don't feel as are necessary. This could have also been soft plastic, but I get the fact that they also wanted to make it consistent, that it's the same material being used in all the same places. This could have, yes, been more denser plastic. Didn't have to be necessarily softer because there really isn't anything here that you need to bend back and forth, unlike the elbows and unlike the shoulders. But again, the fact that they keep the same material in all of this is something, again, I quite like about the figure. Here are the undersides of his feet for no apparent reason whatsoever, just to show you guys he does have flat footing. He doesn't have any peg holes on the undersides of his feet, but I don't have any problems really with Mr. Freeze standing. Despite his size, and even despite the fact that he does have the Cryo Tank on his back, providing you get the knees and the feet completely bent properly. In some cases, I just kind of lean him forward. There we go. He doesn't really have too many issues, like I said, getting him to properly stand. If you do feel like at sometimes he does have a little bit more top heaviness, where the figure is starting to teeter a bit, by all means then you may want to make use of the display stand that also comes included with the figure. Having a look at the figure's articulation, I defaulted back to my preferred favorite face of the two. I think I'm probably just going to go with a more somber, very neutral expression rather than the angrier expression for Mr. Freeze. But his head rotates all the way around. It hinges up and down. And you can also rock it back and forth. At one point I thought the neck could have also shifted around. It seemed like it was connected in such a way that you could rotate the neck. But I think it's just the more so the way it's been attached to the torso and not really an intended place of articulation. So like I said, the head can move up and down, rock back and forth, and you can rotate Victor Freeze's head all the way around. For the torso, now this is something that's kind of interesting. See this little disc on the front? I would have thought this was attached here, but seeing how far up it actually sits, in a way instead they smartly attached it to the lower torso instead, the lower half of the torso, and kept it away from the waist. I mean, this is good in the sense that you can rotate the waist back, the torso back and forth. You got to still be careful, though, when you crunch the torso. Crunching it back or hinging it back isn't so much the issue. When you move it forward, though, you probably can see what's going to happen. Because it's attached here, and because you're constricting the amount of space it has to work with, you may start seeing that the disc is starting to bend out, and you don't want to cause damage to that. It still allows you to move the torso perfectly fine. Just be a little bit more careful when you're moving it forward, though. That may be something you want to be keeping an eye for. As we had already looked at, the soft tubing does allow the arms to hinge outward, and you can get a full 90-degree angle going that way. And even in the arm elbows themselves, you can get almost a 90-degree angle working that way as well. Whatever hands you decide to go with for Mr. Freeze, the hands rotate all the way around. You can also hinge them back and forth. Legs split out. Not as much, though. You're not going to get a full split. You got a bit of a ratchet joint happening on the legs of Mr. Freeze. You can move the legs forward at about a 45-degree angle, and you can also move them back just short of a 45-degree angle. Mr. Freeze has a double hinge on the knee. You can rotate the top of the boots, basically right above the little band of rubber here. And you also have ankle articulation. The feet are very stiff, though. Stiff in the sense that you've got that hinge joint happening right here, but it's very difficult for me to move it up and down. There might be just a little bit of additional paint that's added in there, not allowing me to move the feet up as much as I had hoped. Still, though, despite that, you can get the figure to stand fine. He's a little on the top heavy side, providing you go get the angle on him just right. Mr. Freeze stands perfectly fine, as you can see right there. He is top heavy, yes, but so if you do have a little bit of swaying happening on your figure, then I probably would recommend, of course, making use of the display stand. After all, it's there anyways. You might as well use it. Mondo did some really neat things here with their 6-scale version of Mr. Freeze from Batman the Animated Series. Sort of in the same way that the writers of the original series was able to take what I felt was a two-dimensional character with Mr. Freeze and give him a real complexity to him, giving him a sad backstory that you could easily relate to and understand the reasoning and the motives behind his actions. And I feel this way as well, even though Mr. Freeze sadly was only given 2 episodes to really show his stuff. Those are by far, for me, at least the most standout episodes of the entire Batman the Animated Series run. Heart of Ice was really a sad episode to watch, and you could really, again, relate to why Mr. Freeze did all the stuff that he did in that episode. At the end, you really do want to see him be triumphant, really, in the end of the episode. And again, that's a testament to the writers of the original series. In that regards, Mondo has taken a 2-dimensional version of Mr. Freeze, what you would normally expect in a figure, and elevated it to something much more complex, giving him the highlights and the lowlights. I like the reflective nature of his suit. The bands of the white on of those rubber tubings around his shoulders and, of course, around his elbows could probably have been a little bit thinner. But overall, I mean, the figure feels like he was pulled directly from the series itself. He doesn't have a lot of accessories, unfortunately, being that, again, there wasn't much to pull from. But he comes with all the bases. He hits all those bases of what you would expect a Mr. Freeze to come included with, right down to the fact he does have his Freeze Blast, which is probably one of the few times I'm doing this in final looks. I don't have the packaging here to display along with the figure because of the way he's turning around. It would be clipping the box every single time. So in this case, I've just completely left it off. As I said, this one does have two different versions, a standard release, which was the one that we had to look at today, thanks to the folks over at Mondo. But there was also the Mondo store exclusive as well, which basically gave you everything that we had a look at, along with a mourned version of Mr. Freeze and the Tombstone of Nora, which I think was an exclusive to Batman the comic, the animated series comic. I don't think it actually ever appeared in those two episodes. It's, again, a really stunning version of Mr. Freeze, and it goes perfectly along with the already released Batman the Animated Series 6-scale figure that we've already had a look at on this channel. Seeing what they've been able to pull off with 6-scale versions of these figures, I'm very excited to see what Mondo has in store for Batman the Animated Series fans moving forward. Hopefully we're going to be still getting some villains packed and presented in a 6-scale format. It would be very difficult, I can understand that, and I know most people would probably say instantly a Joker and a Harley Quinn, but what I'm thinking is I would love to see either a Two-Face, the original Two-Face design, or a Clayface. Could you imagine a Clayface presented in a style like this, done only the way that Mondo Tees can present this? If you managed to pick up this figure for yourself, let me know down below in the comment section what you guys think of the Mondo Batman the Animated Series 6-scale rendition of Mr. Freeze. You'll have to excuse me. He's a pretty cool looking figure. If you guys also want to go back and have a look at some of my other Mondo reviews, there's a playlist just for that, including the look at the Batman the Animated Series Batman, which unfortunately I wasn't able to do a comparison side to side with Mr. Freeze. You'll have to put me down for an IOU. I couldn't find that figure at the time of this recording. If I can eventually find that figure, I know I put him in storage. Rest assured, I'll do a follow-up video and I'll do a comparison side to side with this figure right here. But either way, weigh in your thoughts down below, members of the mob, what you guys think of the Mr. Freeze. I always like reading your comments down below. And make sure if you are new to this channel and digging this guy's content, thank you for that, by the way. Make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that bell notification. And make sure you stay tuned because there's going to be a whole lot of videos coming your way. As always, thanks for watching. And I'll see you guys next time.